Callum lifted his glass at the charity dinner and told the whole table that Nora was playing with her little business while he paid for a real life. A few guests laughed the nervous kind of laugh, the kind that fills a silence nobody wants to sit inside. He clicked his metal pen once, the sound landing under the string quartet like a small verdict. Nora straightened the cuff of her left sleeve and said nothing. She had learned that silence traveled further than any answer she could give him at a table like this one. Later that same night, he refused to walk her over to meet his investors, steering her instead toward a table of his golf friends near the bar. "They talk about serious money," he said, folding his napkin as if the subject had already closed itself. She did not ask twice. She picked up her old canvas tote from the coat check, the fabric soft from years of use, and waited by the door until the car arrived. The bag still carried a faded tag from a startup conference 5 years old. Callum called it a museum piece whenever he saw it on the kitchen counter, and he said it again in the car, laughing at his own line. The following week, at his mother's house, Maeve stirred her tea long after the sugar had dissolved and asked Nora if she had found a proper job yet. Callum answered before Nora could open her mouth. "She likes her little hobby," he said, and the whole table smiled like he had told a genuinely good joke. Nora said she had an early morning. Nobody argued. Nobody ever argued when Callum decided a conversation was finished. It was not the first dinner like this one, and it would not be the last. At his firm's spring gathering, he had introduced her to a client as someone who does something with computers, out of a co-working space. Very sweet. She had been in a boardroom that same morning closing a funding round worth more than his firm's entire annual revenue. She did not correct him in front of the client. Correcting him had stopped feeling like a fight worth having months earlier. It had started to feel like arguing with the weather, a waste of breath against something that would not change shape for her. The client, a soft-spoken woman named Priya, asked Nora a few polite follow-up questions anyway, the kind people ask when they sense a conversation has been cut short before it started. Nora answered them briefly and steered the topic back to Callum's firm, watching him visibly relax as the attention returned to where he believed it belonged. At home, the pattern repeated itself in smaller, quieter ways that were somehow harder to name. He signed birthday cards to their friends from us both without asking what she wanted written inside. He told his mother's church group that his wife did something with computers and left it there, like the sentence had nowhere left to go. Each time Nora straightened her sleeve, folded the moment away somewhere private, and kept walking through the rest of her evening. Her own colleagues had stopped asking about her husband months earlier. Imogen, her chief financial officer, had learned to read Nora's silences the way sailors read a change coming in the wind, long before the weather itself arrived. She never said anything about Callum directly. She only straightened the folders on her desk a little more carefully on the mornings after Nora came in quiet, as if order on a desk could study something that had nothing to do with paper. One evening at a neighborhood dinner party, a guest asked Callum what his wife did for a living, since he had done all the talking so far. "Just a little tech thing," he said, waving his hand like he was brushing crumbs off a table. "She's very sweet about it." Nora smiled at the host and changed the subject to the wine, because changing the subject had become its own kind of survival skill. She noticed, walking home that night, that she had stopped expecting anything else from him. It was not sadness exactly, more like the quiet recalibration a person makes when a familiar road turns out to be shorter than they once believed. She sometimes wondered, lying awake beside him, whether he actually believed what he said about her, or whether the words had simply become a habit he no longer noticed himself performing. Either answer felt equally tiring. What mattered more, in the end, was that he never once asked her a real question about her work, not the size of it, not the shape of it, not what kept her at the office until midnight 3 nights a week. At his 40th birthday dinner, held at a restaurant he had chosen for its view rather than its food, he stood to make a toast and thanked everyone who had helped him build a real career from nothing. He looked at Nora when he said the word real, though he never explained what he meant by it. She lifted her glass along with everyone else, the champagne catching the low light of the restaurant's chandelier. Later, walking to the car, He told her the toast had gone well and asked if she had noticed how quiet she'd been all night. She said she had a headache. It was easier than telling him the truth, which was that she had simply run out of things to prove to a room that had already decided what it thought of her. His business partner Desmond made a similar joke at a golf outing that spring, calling Nora the funder of Callum's golf habit, as if her income only existed to subsidize her husband's leisure. Callum laughed loudest of anyone at the table. Nora smiled the polite smile she had practiced for exactly these moments, a smile that cost her nothing and revealed even less. She had stopped bringing her own achievements into rooms like this 1 month earlier, because every time she had, Callum found a way to fold them back down to a size that fit his version of their marriage. Desmond's wife caught Nora's eye across the table during the laughter and did not laugh herself, only offered a small, tired smile of her own. The kind exchanged between two women who recognized the same weather pattern in each other's marriages without ever needing to say so out loud, a smile that lasted only a second before she turned back to her own plate. There had been a time, early in the marriage, when she had tried harder to be understood. She had once shown him a term sheet from her first real funding round, proud of the number printed at the top, and watched him glance at it for 3 seconds before asking whether dinner reservations were still on for 8. She had learned that night, more clearly than any conversation could have taught her, exactly how much room her career was allowed to take up in his attention. After that, she stopped bringing the term sheets home at all. She kept the closing of every major deal to herself after that, celebrating quietly with Imogen over coffee in the office kitchen instead of at home with a bottle of wine Callum would have poured without asking what it was for. The first time she closed a round large enough to make the local business press, she read the article 3 times at her desk before deleting the browser tab, never once mentioning it at dinner that night. Callum spent the meal describing a difficult client call in detail, and she listened, and asked the right questions, and said nothing about her own day at all. A few days before all of that, Callum's assistant called the house to confirm a dinner with 2 of his biggest clients, and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Nora would be joining them. Callum answered before Nora reached the phone, saying she had her own thing that night, though nothing had ever been on her calendar for that evening. She heard him say it from the next room and simply adjusted her own plans to match the lie, because correcting it in front of his assistant would have cost more than the dinner was worth to either of them. One Tuesday morning, Callum left his tablet open on the kitchen island. He had taken an urgent call in his earbuds and rushed out of the house without locking the screen, his coffee still steaming on the counter behind him. Nora only meant to turn the display off before it drained the battery for the day. An email from an investment bank sat open across the screen, the subject line in bold red letters, marked urgent in a way that made her hand pause above the button. The message said his firm had lost its 2 largest clients over the past quarter. It said the company was carrying heavy debt and needed a buyer within weeks, not months. She understood, in that single instant, why he had been short-tempered for so long, snapping at small things, staying late at an office that no longer had much left in it. She had assumed it was ordinary stress. It was something closer to drowning, and he had never said a word about it at home. The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock above the stove, an ordinary Tuesday sound that felt strange against what she was reading. She noticed, almost absurdly, that his coffee had already gone cold in its mug, a small ring forming on the counter beneath it. She thought about how many mornings just like this one she had stood in this same spot, making breakfast for a man who apparently could not bring himself to tell her his company was sinking. Even the toaster popping up on schedule felt like it belonged to a different, simpler morning than the one she was actually standing inside. Her own company was in the middle of reviewing several acquisition targets that same quarter, part of a routine expansion effort Imogen had been running since spring. The name printed across his firm's letterhead looked familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten before her mind caught up. She had seen it once, 2 weeks earlier, buried inside a list of mid-sized consulting firms flagged for financial distress. She had not connected the name to her husband because he never spoke about numbers at home. He only spoke about hers, and only to make them sound smaller than they were. One line in the email stood out in red beneath the rest of the page. Liquidity concern, it read. Immediate acquisition recommended. Below it sat a short paragraph naming 2 board members who had already resigned that month, a detail Callum had never once mentioned at home, not even in passing. Nora read the sentence twice before she remembered to breathe normally, then set the tablet back down exactly where she had found it, the angle unchanged, the screen dark again. Her hands were steady, but her mind was already moving 3 steps ahead, cataloging dates, matching them against months of his short temper and late nights at an office that apparently had far less to keep him there than she had assumed. Callum returned from his call a few minutes later, complaining about a client who would not return his messages. Nora poured his coffee and wiped down the counter where his cold mug had left a ring, giving her hands something ordinary to do while her mind moved fast underneath them. She did not tell anyone that week, not her sister, not her closest friend from business school, not even Imogen at first. She only asked Imogen, quietly, in the smaller of the 2 conference rooms, whether she could personally lead the due diligence on one particular target on the acquisitions list. Imogen straightened the stack of folders in front of her until the edges lined up perfectly, glanced up once, and said only that she would clear the calendar. That was the kind of ally she had always been. The review stretched across several months, and Nora moved through it with a patience that surprised even herself. She opened a private account she had set up years earlier for corporate distributions, used it to fund a short lease on an apartment booked through the company's housing program, and routed the legal paperwork through the firm's internal counsel instead of the family lawyer they had always used together. She kept a single notebook at the apartment, never at home, every date and figure entered by hand, so nothing lived on a shared laptop where Callum might stumble across it the way she had stumbled across his. Meanwhile, the acquisition team ran a full audit of his company's books, room by room, account by account, a process that took the better part of 2 months and pulled in analysts from 3 separate departments. Rowan, the company's lawyer, led the negotiations from her side of the table. He had a habit of taking off his glasses before he delivered anything important, as though the news needed to reach the room without a barrier between his eyes and the people receiving it. He removed them now almost weekly, each time with a new figure that made the picture of Callum's firm a little bleaker than the last. The audit revealed more than Nora had expected. 2 client contracts had lapsed without renewal because nobody on Callum's team had followed up in time. A line of credit meant to cover short-term cash flow had been extended twice already, quietly, without board approval. None of it was fraud, Rowan told her plainly, only mismanagement compounding on itself for the better part of 2 years. Nora listened to each update without comment, the way she listened to every report that crossed her desk, and wrote her own notes in the margins in a private shorthand only she could read later. One figure stayed with her longer than the rest. Payroll for the firm's junior staff had been delayed twice that year, a detail Callum had never mentioned to anyone until pressed. She thought of the young analysts who had no idea their paychecks were late because of decisions made 2 floors above their desks. It was the first moment in the process that made her genuinely angry on someone else's behalf. She asked Rowan to make sure those employees were protected regardless of what happened to Callum himself. Callum did not know that one of the final bidders for his company was owned, quietly and entirely, by his own wife. He believed the offer had come from an anonymous international fund, the kind that bought distressed firms and stripped them down for parts, the kind whose partners never showed their faces until the ink was already dry. He mentioned the fund at dinner once, almost hopeful, calling them serious people, the kind who might finally take his business as seriously as he did. He spent an entire Sunday rehearsing what he might say to them, pacing the living room with a legal pad in one hand, reading lines aloud to Nora as though she were a mirror rather than a person. She listened and offered small, useless suggestions, careful never to reveal how much more she already knew about the numbers behind his pitch than he did. Imogen ran the financial modeling personally, refusing to hand any part of it to a junior analyst, and delivered her final recommendation to Nora on a Friday afternoon in a folder with the edges perfectly squared. The math supported the acquisition on its own merits, she said. independent of anything personal writing underneath it. Nora had never wanted this to be revenge dressed up as strategy. She wanted it to be simply correct, and it was. Imogen asked her once, gently, whether she was certain she wanted to see this through rather than walking away with what she already knew. Walking away would have let him keep believing his own version of events forever, Nora said, and she was no longer willing to leave it unchallenged. She flew out twice that autumn for meetings tied to the deal, telling Callum both times that a client conference had come up on short notice. He never asked which client. She had expected guilt to surface somewhere in those months, some quiet voice asking whether this was fair to a man she had once loved. The voice never arrived. What she felt instead was closer to relief. At home he began to notice something had shifted, though he could not name what it was for weeks. Nora stopped arguing back when he made a comment about her schedule. She stopped explaining herself before leaving for another late meeting. She stopped asking for his approval before making plans of her own, the way she once had out of habit more than need. His mother would have called it a wife finally settling into her place. Callum called it strange at first, then worrying, then something he started watching for without ever saying the word out loud. He began checking her calendar over her shoulder when he thought she wasn't looking, scrolling past meeting titles that meant nothing to him, names of companies he did not recognize and times that never lined up with anything she told him at breakfast. He asked offhand questions at breakfast about who she was seeing that week and why, questions dressed up as casual interest, but landing like small interrogations. He started lingering near the kitchen doorway during her phone calls, pretending to look for coffee filters he already knew were in the cabinet above the sink, straining to catch fragments of conversations conducted in a tone he no longer recognized as familiar. Once, he asked outright why she seemed so calm lately, almost accusing her of hiding something, though he could not have said what. She told him work was going well, which was true in every sense, but the one he was fishing for. He did not push further that night, but she noticed him watching her more closely over the following weeks, the way a man watches weather he cannot read, sensing a storm without being able to name its direction. He even tried, one Saturday, complimenting her work directly for what felt like the first time in years, saying he had heard from a friend of a friend that her company was doing well. She thanked him and said nothing more, unwilling to hand him a single additional detail he might later use to piece the picture together before she was ready for him to see it. She answered every question honestly and told him almost nothing true about the shape of what she was building. Confidence, it turned out, needed no explanation to survive being watched. One night that September, he woke at 2 a.m. and found her side of the bed empty, the bathroom light off, the hallway silent, only a thin line of light visible beneath the kitchen door downstairs. He found her downstairs at the kitchen table with her laptop open, the screen's glow the only light in the room, papers spread beside her in neat, deliberate stacks, a mug of tea gone cold near her elbow. He asked what she was working on so late, and she told him a deal was closing soon, which was true, and closed the laptop before he could see anything more than the edge of a logo he did not recognize. He went back to bed without pressing further, but she heard him lying awake for a long time afterward, the mattress shifting every few minutes the way it did when his mind would not settle, the ceiling fan turning slow, useless circles above him in the dark. Rowan called a late meeting in October and took off his glasses before he spoke, the way he always did. The purchase agreement had been agreed in principle, he told her, and only signatures remained on both sides. Nora read every page of the final packet twice that night, the way she read everything that mattered to her, long after the office around her had gone quiet, the building's cleaning crew moving past her door in slow, unhurried rounds. She signed her name on the last page under a small desk lamp, alone, the pen moving slower than she expected it to, as if some part of her wanted to hold the moment a little longer before it became permanent. Callum still knew nothing about any of it. 2 weeks later, she received a new executive badge granting access to the top floor of the acquired company's building, the floor where Callum's own office sat at the far end of the hallway. She did not slide the badge into her tote bag among her other cards, the way she usually did. She tucked it into the inside pocket of her blazer instead, close to her chest, and did not use it once before the day of the announcement, unwilling to risk being seen in that building a moment before she was ready. The final meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the largest conference room at Callum's firm, the one with the long glass table he had once shown off to Nora during a tour years earlier, back when he had still wanted her opinion of things he had built. His leadership team filled one side of the room, papers stacked in front of them, coffee cooling untouched. Jocelyn, the head of human resources, straightened her name badge twice before the doors opened, a habit she reached for whenever a hard conversation was waiting on the other side of a threshold. She had guessed, weeks before anyone told her officially, that the firm was standing on thin ground. Lawyers from both sides sat near the front of the room with their laptops already open, screens angled toward the projector at the far wall. Callum walked in expecting to shake hands with representatives from a large international fund, a deal he had rehearsed lines for in the mirror that morning. He wore his best suit and clicked his pen once before he sat down, a small ritual for a moment he believed would finally prove something about his career. He shook hands with the lawyers he recognized and nodded politely at the strangers, assuming they represented the fund's operations team. He made a small joke about finally dealing with serious money, the same phrase he had used on Nora years earlier at a different table entirely, and a few of his own staff laughed out of habit rather than amusement. Jocelyn did not laugh. A screen at the front of the room lit up with the acquiring company's official presentation, streamed through the central conference system connected to a laptop belonging to the buyer's legal team, so that every person in the room saw the same documents at the same second. Rowan removed his glasses and set them down on the table in front of him without a word, and the room seemed to understand, before he even spoke, that something large was about to change shape. The name displayed across the screen was Nora's company. A murmur moved through the room before anyone managed to say a full sentence aloud. She entered last, her old canvas tote still over her shoulder, the faded conference tag catching the overhead light as she crossed the floor. One of Callum's own directors leaned toward the colleague beside him and asked, quietly enough that it still carried across the silence, whether that was the chief executive walking in. Callum said nothing at all. For the first time in the history of every dinner and every dismissive joke, he had no line ready to reach for. Someone near the far end of the table closed their notebook out of instinct, as though sensing that the entire conversation had just changed direction and there was nothing left worth writing down. Jocelyn kept her hand resting near her badge, but did not reach for it again, watching the room the way she always watched rooms right before they changed for good. The meeting continued afterward in careful, professional tones, the way business meetings always continue, no matter how badly the ground beneath them has shifted. Callum's chief operating officer, a heavy-set man named Wallace who had worked beside him for a decade, leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, the sound audible across the table. He glanced at Callum twice, waiting for some cue, some sign of what to say next, but Callum's eyes stayed fixed on the screen as though the presentation might change if he simply watched it long enough. Nobody in the room moved to fill the silence for him. Even the projector fans seemed loud in the stillness that followed, a small mechanical hum filling the space where someone might have spoken. Rowan walked the room through the terms in a flat, steady voice, glasses still resting on the table in front of him. New leadership would be announced within 30 days, he said. Current executive roles would be reviewed individually as part of the transition. Callum stared at the screen the entire time, his pen sitting untouched beside his notepad for the first time anyone in that building had ever seen. A junior member of his own finance team, seated near the back, quietly began typing notes into her phone under the table, the first draft of a message she would send to her sister that night describing exactly what she had just watched happen. One of the senior partners asked, carefully, whether the founder herself would be present for the transition period. Rowan simply nodded toward the door, where Nora had been standing quietly for several minutes already, letting the room absorb the news before she spoke a word into it. She walked to the head of the table, set her tote bag down on an empty chair, and thanked everyone for their patience during a long and thorough process. Her voice carried none of the triumph the room might have expected. It carried only the calm, procedural tone of someone closing a deal she had already lived inside for months. Nora signed the final copy of the agreement in front of the room, her handwriting steady, and slid it back across the glass table without a single word directed at her husband. Jocelyn watched the signature land on the page and felt something in her chest loosen, the particular relief of watching a long-suspected problem finally become an official one, small and solvable, instead of a private dread she alone had been carrying through the halls for weeks. After the meeting ended, Callum caught up with Nora in the hallway outside the elevator bank, his footsteps faster than usual against the polished floor. His voice was quieter than she had heard it in years, almost unrecognizable without its usual edge. He said they could start over, that none of this had to mean the end of the marriage. He even asked her not to file for anything yet, the words tumbling out faster than she had ever heard him speak. He tried, briefly, to explain himself, saying he had only ever meant the jokes lightly, that he never intended for any of it to land the way it apparently had. Nora let him finish. She had spent years listening to him finish sentences that cost her something, and she saw no reason to interrupt this last one. When he was done, the hallway was quiet enough that she could hear the elevator working somewhere behind the doors. A junior associate from her own legal team passed them in the hallway just then, glanced between them once, and kept walking without a word, the way people learn to do around a conversation that clearly isn't theirs to enter, the sound of the associate's footsteps fading toward the stairwell. Nora straightened the cuff of her left sleeve and looked at him without anger and without softness either, the way she might look at a report that had finally come back with numbers she already expected. "You were right," she said. "It was not a career." There was a pause long enough for the elevator to chime somewhere down the hallway behind her, a small mechanical sound filling the space where his answer might have gone. "It was the future," she said, and lifted her old canvas tote higher onto her shoulder. Callum reached for his pen out of pure habit and clicked it once, but the sound only underlined how little he had left to say into the silence that followed it. Nora walked toward the elevator without looking back at him or at the room behind her. The elevator doors began to close just as Callum took half a step forward, his hand lifting slightly, as if reaching for a sentence that never arrived in time. The most dangerous kind of humiliation is the kind that people dress up as care, or worse, as a joke told at someone else's dinner table. Do you think Nora's ending was fair, or should she have done something differently to him? Tell me your honest answer in the comments below. If this story hit you the way it hit me while writing it, hit like and subscribe for more stories just like this one.